Rancher lived alone for 5 years. Then a tribe of Bigfoot showed up. The creatures that took my dog left behind footprints 18 inches long and claw marks 8 feet up on trees. When they came for my horse and me that last night, their coordinated attack proved these mountains harbored something far more intelligent and dangerous than anything described in wildlife manuals. What I experienced during my 5 years of isolation in the Olympic Mountains changed everything I thought I knew about what exists out there in our deepest woods. My name is Derek Thompson, and until recently, I lived completely alone in a remote cabin 25 miles from the nearest neighbor. The isolation wasn't by accident. It was exactly what I needed after losing everything that had ever defined my life. The divorce papers came on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered by a process server who wouldn't meet my eyes. Elizabeth had taken everything: the house, half the ranch, and, most importantly, our daughter Katie. The custody agreement gave me every other weekend, which felt like a cruel joke after 23 years of marriage. That night, I sat in the empty house that would soon belong to someone else, nursing a bottle of whiskey and staring at walls that held decades of memories, now destined to be packed and divided like assets in a liquidation. By dawn, I'd made my decision. I couldn't stay and watch my old life get dismantled piece by piece. I needed to disappear, to find a place where the pain couldn't follow me. The cabin came from old Bill Henderson at the feed store. His grandfather had built it deep in the Olympic Mountains way back in the 1920s, accessible only by an old logging road that had been reclaimed by the forest decades ago. Bill said it was still standing, solid as the day it was built, with a horse stall and a well that never ran dry. More importantly, it was 40 miles from the nearest town, far enough that the world could finally leave me alone. The transaction took 3 weeks to finalize. I sold everything I couldn't carry and loaded my pickup with the essentials: tools, medical supplies, enough canned food to feed a small army, ammunition and books. My horse, Duke, a 15-year-old quarter horse, came with me along with my border collie mix, Buck. Both animals seemed to sense the finality of our departure as we left civilization behind. The last 40 miles took nearly 3 hours to navigate. What Bill had generously called a road was really just 2 tire tracks separated by weeds, snaking through dense woods that seemed to close in behind us. When we finally arrived at the clearing where the cabin stood, I understood why Bill's grandfather had chosen this spot. The cabin was exactly as advertised, a solid log structure with a weathered metal roof. The stable was built into the hillside behind it, its heavy timber frame still strong despite decades of neglect. A small creek ran along the western edge of the clearing, providing fresh water and a peaceful soundtrack. But what struck me most was the absolute silence when I shut off the truck's engine. No traffic, no machinery, no human sounds at all. That first night, lying on the narrow bunk, listening to Buck snore by the fireplace and Duke shift in his stall, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: peace. The first few weeks tested every survival skill I'd learned growing up on the ranch. The cabin's wood stove required constant attention. I had to learn the quirks of the hand pump that drew water from the well and figure out why the stable door wouldn't latch properly. But every small victory felt meaningful in a way that signing contracts and attending business meetings never had. I established routines that gave structure to the long days. Morning chores came first: feeding and watering Duke, checking his hooves and coat, cleaning his stall. Buck needed less attention but more exercise, so we'd spend an hour each morning walking the perimeter of the clearing. Afternoons were for maintenance and improvements. The cabin had good bones, but decades of neglect had taken their toll. I replaced missing chinking between the logs, repaired loose floorboards, and installed better latches on the shutters. Evenings belonged to books and planning. I'd brought the equivalent of a library's worth of material: survival guides, wildlife identification books, medical manuals, and novels to keep my mind occupied through the long winter nights ahead. By lamplight, I'd read and make notes in a journal I'd started keeping, documenting everything from weather patterns to animal behavior. My first trip to town came 3 weeks after arrival, when my coffee supply threatened to run dry. I saddled Duke for the long trip down the mountain, with Buck trotting alongside us as we navigated the overgrown logging road. The town of Timber Creek was exactly what you'd expect from a place with 800 residents. A main street with the essentials, surrounded by modest homes and a few light industrial buildings. At Murphy's General Store, I stocked up on coffee, salt, sugar, and other staples I couldn't produce myself. The clerk, a middle-aged woman named Nancy, seemed curious about the stranger buying supplies in bulk, but she didn't probe beyond warning me to be careful of bears emerging from hibernation. Summer arrived gradually, bringing longer days and the kind of beauty that made the isolation feel like a privilege rather than a punishment. Wildflowers bloomed throughout the clearing, Indian paintbrush, lupine, and bear grass, creating a carpet of color that shifted weekly. I built a small garden behind the cabin, clearing trees to create enough sunlight for vegetables. The soil was rich with decades of decaying leaves, and the seeds sprouted with enthusiasm. The isolation that had initially felt overwhelming became comfortable, then precious. Weeks would pass without seeing another human being, and I found myself forgetting entire conversations I'd once considered important. Here, success was measured in simpler terms. Did I have enough split firewood for the winter? Was Duke healthy and content? Could I fix the loose board on the stable wall before it got worse? Buck adapted to our new life with the enthusiasm of a dog bred for outdoor work. He appointed himself guardian of the clearing, patrolling the tree line each morning and evening with serious concentration. Duke took longer to adjust, having been used to the company of other horses and regular ranch work, but he gradually settled into our quiet routine, seeming to find satisfaction in the peaceful rhythms of our isolated life. My monthly trips into town became social events of a sort. Nancy at the general store always had news to share, and I began to look forward to these conversations, brief windows into the world I'd left behind without the pain of actual participation. Winter came early that first year, with snow falling in October and lingering until March. The isolation became total. The logging road disappeared under several feet of snow, making trips into town impossible. I prepared carefully, stocking firewood and food, but nothing quite prepares you for the absolute silence of a mountain winter. The cold was brutal, but manageable with proper preparation. I'd insulated the cabin walls with old blankets and newspapers, creating a cozy interior that stayed comfortable as long as I kept the fire going. Buck loved the snow, bounding through blizzards like a puppy despite being almost 8 years old. The months of forced solitude gave me time to think, really think for the first time in years. The return of spring felt like a resurrection. As the snow melted and the first wildflowers appeared, I realized I hadn't just survived my first winter, but somehow I'd thrived. The pattern repeated with variations over the next 4 years. Each season brought its own challenges and rewards. I learned to read the subtleties of mountain weather, to anticipate when storms would arrive and when they would pass. I became proficient in ways I'd never imagined. I could fell trees with precision, cure hides, repair almost anything that broke. Routine became meditation. Every task had its purpose, every day its rhythm. I woke with the sun, worked with my hands, went to bed when it got dark. The simplicity was liberating in ways my old life, with its constant cacophony of distractions, never had been. But around the beginning of the 5th year, strange things started happening. At first, they were details so small I could easily dismiss them. Tools I remembered leaving in one place would turn up in another. Firewood I'd carefully stacked would be found disheveled, as if someone had rummaged through it. Buck began behaving differently on our morning walks, stopping to sniff the air with his ears forward and muscles tensed, as if sensing something I couldn't perceive. What finally forced me to pay serious attention were the tracks I found one April morning. It had snowed lightly overnight, leaving a thin layer of fresh snow on the ground. When I went out to fetch water, I saw impressions that made me stop dead in my tracks. These weren't bear tracks, though they were nearly as large. They weren't elk or any other game animal I could identify. These were different, vaguely human in shape, but much larger, perhaps 18 inches long and proportionally wide. The depth of the impressions suggested tremendous weight, far more than any human could cause. The toes were clearly visible, 5 of them, but longer and more splayed than human toes. And there were claws, distinct pointed impressions at the end of each toe. The tracks formed a trail that led from the tree line to a spot about 20 feet from the cabin, then back into the woods. Whatever had made them had stood near my home while I slept. I spent that morning following the trail as far as I could. The tracks led deep into the forest, moving with a stride length that suggested great height and long legs. Sometimes the steps were spaced normally, as if the creature was walking. Other times they were far apart, as if it were running or leaping. Eventually, I lost the trail where the ground became too rocky to hold impressions. That night I sat in the cabin with my rifle within reach, listening to every creak and whisper of the forest outside. Buck was restless, pacing from window to window and occasionally growling at sounds I couldn't hear. Duke was also nervous in his stall, stamping and snorting in ways that suggested anxiety rather than his usual nighttime behavior. Dawn arrived without incident, but the peace I had enjoyed for 5 years was shattered. Something was out there, something big and bold enough to approach my home while I slept. Over the next few weeks, the incidents escalated. More tracks appeared, sometimes multiple sets, suggesting that multiple creatures were visiting the clearing. I found trees with claw marks gouged into the bark, some 8 feet or more off the ground. The marks were fresh, sap still oozing where the claws had penetrated deep into the wood. One morning, I discovered that my entire, carefully stacked pile of firewood had been overturned, not simply knocked over, but scattered across 30 feet of the clearing with a force that would have required tremendous strength. Some of the heavier logs, weighing over 100 pounds each, had been thrown several yards. I began documenting everything, taking photographs, making plaster casts of the tracks, measuring the claw marks. The scientist in me that had been dormant for years awoke, fascinated by the mystery even as the rest of me grew increasingly alarmed. The sounds began around late May. At first, they came only occasionally, thuds against trees, sounds that were too rhythmic and deliberate to be caused by wind or falling branches. Then, vocalizations began to come, screams that echoed through the forest at night, unlike any animal I knew. They weren't the howls of wolves or the cries of cougars. These sounds were deeper, more resonant, and carried a quality I can only describe as deliberate, as if whatever was making them wanted me to hear them. One June night, the pattern changed. I was outside after dark, securing the stable for the night when I heard movement at the tree line. Not the normal rustling of a small animal, but the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the underbrush. Buck began barking frantically, his fur bristling along his spine. Duke was kicking in his stall, his eyes showing white around the edges. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it towards the trees. The lower branches were shaking, flashes of movement could be seen, but nothing clear. Whatever was there was big enough to make the undergrowth shake violently as it moved. I backed slowly towards the cabin, keeping the light trained on the trees. Just before I reached the door, I saw it. For just a second, a figure briefly stood out against the clearer sky where the forest opened up. It was huge, easily 8 feet tall, broad-shouldered, and covered in what looked like dark fur. It moved with a distinctly bipedal gait, not on all fours like a bear, but upright like a human, yet with a shape impossible to mistake for any person. Then it disappeared back into the shadows, and all that was left was the sound of snapping branches as it moved away. I spent that night sleepless, rifle loaded and ready, every nerve on edge. But nothing else happened. The forest remained silent, almost too silent, as if every living thing were holding its breath. In the morning, I found more tracks, these closer to the cabin than before. One set led right up to my bedroom window, the impressions deep in the soft ground, showing where something had stood, peering in while I lay awake just a few feet away. July brought the incident that changed everything. I'd gone out on a foraging trip, gathering wild berries and medicinal plants that grew in a meadow about 3 miles away. Buck came with me, as always, trotting along cheerfully while I filled my pack with the summer's bounty. We were out most of the day, enjoying the warm weather and the season's abundance. When we returned to the clearing near dusk, I knew immediately something was wrong. Duke was running loose, something he never did. I always secured him safely in his stall before leaving. The stable door was wide open, hanging on its hinges in a way that suggested it had been ripped off its fastenings rather than simply opened. Inside the stall, I found evidence of a violent struggle. Straw was scattered everywhere. The stall walls showed marks where Duke had kicked in panic, and there was blood, not much, but enough to make my heart leap into my throat. Duke's halter hung torn, the strong leather strap ripped as if it were paper. More disturbing still were the tracks. The now familiar tracks of large, clawed feet were all over the stall floor, mixed with Duke's hooves, as he had evidently fought against his attackers. Because I was now sure there had been more than one. The tracks showed at least 3 different creatures, maybe more. I spent hours searching for Duke, calling his name and following the tracks that led out of the stall and into the woods. But the light faded too quickly, and eventually, I had to admit defeat. Duke was gone, taken by creatures that shouldn't exist. That night, Buck wouldn't leave my side. The normally confident dog was clearly terrified, trembling against my legs as I sat in the cabin with all the windows shut and my rifle in my lap. I could hear things moving outside, the now familiar sounds of heavy footsteps circling the cabin. Occasionally, a thump would come, the sound of something hitting the cabin logs with what sounded like a stick or branch. Not hard enough to do damage, but loud enough to let me know they were there. At some point around midnight, Buck began to whimper. Not his normal alert bark, but a low, persistent sound of pure fear. His eyes were fixed on the door, and I could see his body trembling uncontrollably. I moved to a position where I could see the door and the window, my rifle aimed at the entrance. I could hear them clearly now, just outside. Not just footsteps, but something else. Sounds that might have been communication, deep chirps and grunts that almost seemed to have patterns, like language. We remained like that until dawn, Buck and I waiting for something to happen, but the creatures didn't attack. They simply waited outside, letting me know they were there, they were watching, they could take what they wanted when they wanted. When sunlight finally filled the clearing, I dared to venture outside. The area around the cabin was a mess of tracks, dozens of them, showing where multiple large creatures had spent the night circling my home. Some of the tracks showed details I hadn't seen before, the texture of the skin on the soles of the feet, the joints where the toes bent, even what might have been lines on the palms. These weren't just big feet, they were functional, complex feet belonging to living, breathing creatures. I spent that day fortifying the cabin as best I could. I nailed boards over the windows, reinforced the door with extra wooden beams, and installed stronger latches on all access points. I also prepared emergency supplies, gathering everything I might need if I had to leave in a hurry. Food, water, ammunition, essentials. Part of me knew I should leave already, but another part The part that had lived here for 5 years and found peace in this isolation wasn't willing to be driven out. That night they returned. I heard them early, just after dark. The now familiar heavy footsteps circling the cabin, the occasional thumps against the walls. But tonight, there was something different about their behavior. They were moving more deliberately, more coordinated. Through the gaps in the boards I'd nailed over the windows, I could see them moving in the shadows. Tall, broad figures that blocked out the stars as they passed in front of the open spaces between trees. I counted at least 6 different ones, possibly more. The attack began around midnight. It wasn't the tentative approach of previous nights, but a full-on assault. Something struck the door with tremendous force, shaking the entire structure. The impact was followed by another, then another, as if multiple creatures were taking turns hammering at the walls. I could hear them vocalizing as they attacked, not random grunts, but what sounded like real coordination, calling to each other with specific patterns of sounds. The roof began to shake. They were on top of the cabin, their heavy footsteps shaking the beams overhead. Something large struck the metal roof, creating a noise that sounded like thunder in the enclosed space. Buck was in full panic now, running back and forth and howling. I began firing through the walls in the direction of the sounds. The report of the rifle was deafening in the confined space, but the plan worked. The banging stopped immediately, replaced by sounds of withdrawal. I fired again and again, working the bolt action as fast as my trembling hands would allow. Through the muzzle flash of the rifle, I caught glimpses of huge shapes moving away from the building. Within seconds, the area around the cabin fell silent, except for Buck's ragged breathing and my own pounding heart. Several days passed before I dared do more than briefly poke my head outside. The creatures had retreated, but the signs of their attack were everywhere. Deep gouges in the cabin's log walls, massive footprints pressed into the earth around the building, and dark stains that could have been blood where my shots had found their mark. I was beginning to understand. We were being hunted by creatures possessing intelligence, patience, and capabilities far beyond anything that nature was supposed to contain. And tonight, they were coming for us. That night, they arrived. I lay on my bunk, rifle across my chest and ears, straining for any unusual sound when I heard the first step. Not the rustle of a branch or the whisper of leaves that might indicate normal wildlife, but the unmistakable sound of something large walking deliberately across the clearing. More footsteps followed, coming from different directions. They were circling the cabin, moving with a coordination that suggested intelligence and planning. I counted at least 6 distinct sets of footsteps, probably more. Then came the first blow. It wasn't the tentative tap of a lost hiker or the scratch of an animal investigating something new. This was a deliberate, forceful impact against the front wall of the cabin, delivered with enough power to shake the entire structure. It was followed by another blow, then another, as if multiple creatures were testing the building's construction. I slid off the bunk and crawled to the front window, rifle at the ready. Through a gap in the boards I'd nailed over the glass, I could see shapes moving in the starlight, tall humanoid figures that dwarfed anything that should have existed in these mountains. One stood near the door, easily 8 feet tall and covered in dark fur. As I watched, it raised a massive fist and hammered against the wall again. The sound was answered by similar impacts from other directions. They were now all around the cabin, and the building felt increasingly fragile under their assault. I could hear them calling to each other, not the roars or grunts I might have expected from animals, but sounds that were almost conversational. They were communicating, coordinating their attack. From the stable came a sound that chilled me more than anything else, the terrified whinny of Duke. The horse was in total panic, and I could hear him kicking against the stall walls. Whatever was outside the cabin was threatening him too. I made a decision that probably saved our lives. Instead of staying in the cabin and hoping the walls would hold, I grabbed my rifle and a box of ammunition and bolted for the back door. The distance to the stable was only about 30 yards, but it felt like a mile as I ran across the open ground. The stable door was secured with a heavy wooden bar, and I slammed it into place just as something large struck the outside wall. Through the gaps between the boards, I could see shapes moving around the building. Not just one or two, but many. They seemed to be everywhere at once. Duke was going wild with fear, rearing and kicking in his stall until I thought he might hurt himself. I moved to his side and tried to calm him with voice and touch, but he was beyond reason. His eyes showed white around the edges, and his muscles trembled with terror. The first impact against the stable door nearly knocked me off my feet. Whatever struck it possessed enormous strength, and the heavy wooden bar creaked ominously under the force. A second impact followed, then a third, each one harder than the last. Between impacts, I could hear them outside, moving around the building, probing different areas for weakness. The sounds they made were unlike anything I had ever heard, a mix of grunts, clicks, and what might have been words in some unknown language. I positioned myself with a clear view of the door and raised my rifle. If they managed to get inside, I'd have maybe 1 or 2 shots before they reached me. Against creatures of that size and strength, I wasn't sure even direct hits would stop them. The attacks on the door intensified, coming in rhythm now as if multiple creatures were taking turns. Each impact shook the entire building, and I could see the wooden bar beginning to splinter. It wouldn't hold much longer. That's when I started firing. I aimed at the points where the sounds were loudest, hoping to hit something vital through the wooden walls. The report of the rifle was deafening in the confined space, and Duke's panic reached new heights with each shot. But the plan worked. The impacts on the door stopped immediately, replaced by sounds of withdrawal. I fired again and again, working the bolt action as fast as my trembling hands would allow. Through the muzzle flash of the rifle, I caught glimpses of huge shapes moving away from the building, their retreat marked by ground-shaking footsteps. Within seconds, the area around the stable fell silent, except for Duke's ragged breathing and my own pounding heart. I waited with my rifle ready, expecting another assault, but none came. Whatever had hit those shots through the walls had apparently convinced the others that the cost of continuing the attack was too high. Dawn arrived slowly, and I spent the first few hours of the morning listening for any sign that the creatures were still nearby. When I finally gathered the courage to open the stable door and look outside, the clearing appeared empty, but the evidence of the night's events was unmistakable. Deep gouges in the wooden walls of the stable, massive footprints pressed into the earth around both buildings, and dark stains that could have been blood where my shots had found their mark. I knew I couldn't stay any longer. Whatever these creatures were, they had moved from observation to direct assault. The next attack might come during the day when I wouldn't have walls to hide behind. I had to get Duke and myself out of the mountains before they regrouped and tried again. It took 3 hours of patient work to convince Duke to leave the stable. The horse was still traumatized by the night's events, but his trust in me finally overcame his terror. I loaded only the most essential supplies: food, water, ammunition, and the photographs and plaster casts that documented my encounters with the creatures. The journey down the mountain was the longest 40 miles of my life. Every shadow could have hidden a watching figure. Every sound of wind through the trees could have been footsteps, but we made it to town without incident, and I never looked back. I sold the cabin to the first buyer who would take it, sight unseen, for less than half of what I'd paid. I never told them about the creatures that had driven me out. What would have been the point? They would have thought I was crazy, and maybe I was. 5 years of isolation can do strange things to a man's mind. But the evidence was real. The photographs, the plaster casts, the claw marks on Buck's collar, it was all in a box in my new apartment in town. Proof that something impossible had shared those mountains with me for months before finally deciding I'd overstayed my welcome. Sometimes late at night, when the wind shakes my windows, I think about those creatures still living in the deep woods. I wonder if they've returned to the cabin, claimed it as their own. I wonder if they remember the strange human who lived among them for 5 years before fear finally drove him back to civilization. Most of all, I wonder if Buck is still out there somewhere, running with a pack that is not quite wolf, not quite human, but something entirely more mysterious than either. The mountains guard their secrets well, but sometimes those secrets fight back when disturbed. I learned that lesson the hard way, and I'll never forget the sound of those massive footsteps circling my home in the darkness, or the intelligence behind the coordinated attack that finally drove me out. There are things living in our deepest woods that science doesn't recognize and maps don't show. I know because I lived among them for 5 years and survived to tell the tale. Whether anyone believes it is another matter entirely, but the Pacific Northwest isn't the only place harboring these creatures. The evidence keeps piling up. Look at the photographic evidence that has surfaced from this next encounter in the wild.